As the world becomes increasingly fractured by power struggles and conflicts of interest, can a hardline strategy truly safeguard America's superpower status? The Trump Doctrine overturned many long-standing principles of U.S. foreign policy, choosing confrontation over compromise. It is time for a candid reckoning. Is the Trump Doctrine a bold lever of strength or a double-edged sword for America's global leadership? Imagine you're attending an important meeting where people are debating U.S. foreign policy. During the discussion, the Trump Doctrine is mentioned, but you may find it somewhat vague and hard to understand. In reality, the Trump Doctrine is not a clear-cut strategy from the start. It is simply a term that emerged throughout Trump's presidency during discussions, yet it lacked an official definition. Despite much debate, the Trump administration did not clearly define its foreign policy strategy, leaving people confused. However, things began to become clearer when a classified memo from the Department of Defense was leaked. This memo, released by Alexander Valdez Green, the acting Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time, provided a clearer picture of what was truly happening behind the scenes. It was not an easily accessible document, but this memo revealed the key priorities in the Trump administration's foreign policy. It was not just a set of ordinary pages, but a roadmap outlining the crucial military and political strategies that Trump implemented in a rapidly changing world. When discussing the Trump Doctrine, the core concept to understand is the priority demands. This serves as the roadmap for U.S. foreign policy decisions under Trump, with three main objectives: economic security, a strong defense, and maintaining global influence. This is similar to previous U.S. doctrines such as the Monroe Doctrine, which focused on safeguarding national security and economic standing. However, what's interesting is that Trump didn't just talk about these goals, he acted on them. One of the biggest challenges he faced was the rise of China. In particular, Taiwan became a focal point in Trump's strategy. Taiwan is not only crucial to the global economy due to its semiconductor industry, but also plays a strategic role in the technological race between the US and China. If China were to gain control of Taiwan, the US would lose its advantage in the high-tech industry. In any conflict between China and Taiwan, the US could not stay on the sidelines. The greatest concern was Taiwan's defense capabilities when faced with an increasingly powerful China. Therefore, the Trump Doctrine clearly indicated that if China were to attack Taiwan, the US would have to intervene not only to defend Taiwan, but also to protect its key strategic interest. Ultimately, all these decisions aimed at one common goal: safeguarding US interests in a challenging world. When discussing the Trump Doctrine, one cannot overlook an extremely tense scenario: a two-front war. Imagine the US having to fight not just in one place, but in two places simultaneously, one in Europe with Russia and one in Asia with China. This is the challenge the Trump Doctrine had to face. This dual conflict strategy forces the US to divide its military forces, fighting in Europe while simultaneously countering China in Asia. This creates significant strain on the US military, as it cannot effectively deploy forces when they are spread so thin. This will reduce the effectiveness of each campaign, making it difficult for the US to respond to emergencies. While the US is preoccupied with China, Russia could seize the opportunity to increase its influence in Europe. This is the strategy Russia might adopt. As the US focuses its energy on China, Russia could act without facing strong opposition from the US. This is the dual threat, forcing the US to grapple with the difficulty of fighting on two fronts at once. The concept of a two-front war in the Trump Doctrine is not just theoretical, but a harsh reality. To succeed on both fronts, the US needs to maintain a strong and flexible military force. However, with limited resources, particularly military and financial, sustaining power in both conflicts is no easy task. So the question is, does the US have the capacity to protect its interests on both fronts without depleting its resources? The answer will determine the future of this strategy and America's global influence in an increasingly unstable world. In any military strategy, resources are always a critical factor. And with the Trump Doctrine facing the scenario of a two-front war, the issue of resources becomes even more urgent. If the US has to fight simultaneously in both Asia and Europe, it will need to rapidly ramp up military production. But this is far from easy. Weapon and ammunition factories will have to operate at full capacity, while supply chains, transportation, and distribution will be pushed to their limits. A small mistake could lead to the forces on the battlefield lacking the necessary equipment. It's not just about production. The allocation of forces is also a major challenge. the US will have to divide its military between two fronts without neglecting either. If too much focus is placed on Asia to counter China, Europe could easily become a target for Russia. On the other hand, if the forces are spread too thin, both fronts will be weakened. And the issue isn't limited to just the military. Finance, intelligence, logistics, everything must be allocated intelligently and effectively. Because in a prolonged war, maintaining strength isn't just about who has more weapons, but about who manages resources more wisely. So, if a two-front war does occur, the Trump doctrine will have to answer a very difficult question. How can the US be strong enough to win, yet not exhaust itself along the way? The world of foreign affairs, communication is not just a skill, it is a matter of survival. Yet under President Trump, the communication of foreign policy faced numerous issues. While the Trump administration had clear strategic priorities, their communication was inconsistent, sometimes even confusing. Allies struggled to understand what the US wanted, while the American public found it difficult to grasp long-term goals. When policies are not clearly articulated, the inevitable result is widespread skepticism and a lack of trust. The situation was further complicated by internal divisions within the administration. Senior advisors often disagreed, making it impossible to establish a unified vision for foreign affairs. This made the US appear as an unpredictable player on the global stage, reducing the effectiveness of its strategy and making international partners feel uneasy. Even though some military experts may have understood Trump's intentions to some extent, the public and international partners still saw things as unclear. As a result, instead of fostering cohesion, this lack of clarity bred uncertainty and eroded trust. In a rapidly changing world, communication is no longer a nice-to-have, but a must-have. And if there's one lesson the Trump era leaves in this area, it is the critical importance of telling the world clearly and consistently what you truly want. When it comes to European security, the Trump doctrine brought about a radically different approach. Trump no longer wanted the US to bear the bulk of the defense burden for Europe. Instead, he pressured NATO countries to take more responsibility for their own defense, especially in the face of the increasingly apparent threat from Russia. One of the biggest pressures from the Trump administration was the demand for NATO members to significantly increase their defense spending. According to him, allies had relied on the US for too long without sharing enough of the burden. This was a bold request that immediately sparked waves of reaction across Europe. While some countries, like Spain, made small adjustments, the majority of these efforts remained modest. Many countries struggled due to limited budgets and domestic priorities, making it difficult to increase defense spending. Beyond financial contributions, Trump also wanted Europe to develop its own defense industry to reduce dependence on US weapons and military equipment. However, in reality, building a strong enough defense industry proved to be a complex challenge. Political and economic conflicts, as well as divisions among member states, made the process slow and complicated. In summary, while the Trump doctrine pushed Europe to make changes, the results were mixed. Efforts were made, but success remained far off, and the relationship between the US and its allies became more unstable as a result. One of the most challenging issues faced by the Trump doctrine was how to maintain global stability, especially as the world became increasingly heated with conflicts. On the strategic chessboard, the two biggest adversaries for the US were Russia and China, each presenting its own set of challenges. The Russia-Ukraine war ignited concerns over security in Europe. Although the US was not directly involved in combat, Russia remained a significant threat, not only to Ukraine, but also to NATO. In response, the Trump administration had to provide military aid to Ukraine while ensuring the situation did not spiral out of control. But this was no easy task. While there was domestic debate in the US about the aid, the actual effectiveness of the support remained uncertain. On top of that, the US had to contend with a rapidly rising China in the Asia-Pacific region, with one hand trying to hold back Russia in Europe, and the other focused on containing China in Asia. This two-front scenario was an extremely difficult balancing act for the Trump doctrine to navigate. The need to spread resources across both fronts caused US strategy to become both forward-moving and cautious. There were some small successes, but also numerous failures, from struggling to control Russia's actions to facing China's increasingly aggressive moves. In summary, the Trump doctrine made significant efforts to maintain America's global standing amidst a multitude of challenges, but the ultimate outcome remains uncertain, with many looming risks that could destabilize the future. Within the context of the Trump doctrine, One of the greatest challenges for the US was managing strategic tensions while facing Russia and China simultaneously. Despite efforts to drive a wedge between these two major powers, the reality unfolded in a way that contradicted expectations. One crucial goal, to separate Russia from China, similar to what Nixon achieved during the Cold War, proved nearly impossible. Today, Russia and China are increasingly intertwined, not only militarily, but also sharing broad strategic interests to counterbalance American influence. This presents a significant challenge for any strategy aimed at weakening the alliance between these two nations. Moreover, the Trump administration's foreign policy was further hindered by internal contradictions. While the US was trying to address China's growing rise in Asia and curb Russia's actions in Europe, maintaining a balanced and effective foreign strategy became progressively more difficult. If the situation changes, for instance, if the threat from Russia diminishes, the security landscape in Europe will shift. European nations may reduce defense spending, decrease their dependence on NATO, and become more self-reliant in protecting their own interests. Conversely, if Russia ceases to be a primary concern, the US would be forced to shift its focus to the Indo-Pacific, increasing its presence to counter a rapidly expanding China. However, such a strategic pivot is far from simple. China is now a comprehensive adversary, with its economic and military capabilities continuously growing, forcing the US to prepare for a long-term, more challenging competition than ever before. In conclusion, the Trump doctrine encountered profound contradictions in its attempt to maintain global influence as Russia and China grew ever more closely aligned. Potential strategic shifts, whether in Europe or Asia, promise both opportunities and risks as the world order continues to evolve under the pressure of emerging global powers. In a world of chaos and fierce competition, can an America First strategy truly protect the nation's superpower status? The Trump doctrine has challenged every traditional norm, delivering powerful blows on the foreign policy front, but it has also left behind countless dangerous cracks. Glorious success or bitter failure? Let's take a hard look at the bright spots and the dark shadows this doctrine has etched into America's global policies.